Dr. Flores, in addition to being professor at Penn, he's a CUNY graduate, he's a public-facing intellectual, and his book, which relates to the talk today, is called Becoming the System, his forthcoming book, A Racial Linguistic Genealogy of Bilingual Education in the Post-Civil Rights Era. Thank you again, Nelson, for being with us. Sorry for the discombobulated nature of the introduction. We had a more eloquent person lined up for you today, but she couldn't be here.
No problem. So I will just share my screen, and while I'm sharing my screen, I'll say that it's really excited to be here today to present to all of you all. And as was mentioned, this is kind of thinking that I'm working on. I think it's a little ambitious to call the book forthcoming yet, but I'm working on it. And this is some of my thinking, and this is some of my thinking in the book that I'm working on right now. And so I wanted to start by looking at kind of 3 different eras and 3 different kind of ways of describing the language practices of populations that I would describe as racialized bilinguals. And so in 1920, we have Leonard Bloomfield, who was a prominent American linguist, quite famous for studying Native American languages, describing the language practices of White Thunder, a Native American man who he described as speaking less English than Menominee, and that is a strong indictment for his Menominee is atrocious, right? And then he kind of concludes, he may be said to speak no language tolerably. And so we fast forward 50 years to the 1970s, which is where I'll spend kind of a chunk of this talk. And we then have a prominent scholar in bilingual education, Jim Cummings, who describes students that he's talking about as semilingual. He describes them using the term semilingualism and determines that these are individuals that know 2 languages poorly. And then we switch to the 2000s, in 2000, where Cummings suggests that there's little dispute about the existence of the phenomenon to which the term semilingualism was applied. I would beg to differ about that, but that's what he said. But suggested that this was limited access to academic literate registers in both L1 and L2. And so I'm very interested in tracing what I call the specter of semilingualism, which is this kind of long-standing ideology that racialized bilingual people somehow don't speak any language well. And there's a long-standing tradition of it, and it's an ideology that continues to recirculate and be reconfigured to adapt to new contexts, but it never dies. It kind of resurrects itself always, and continues to kind of be prominent in the ways that the language practices of racialized bilingual populations are described in mainstream representations in the academic literature. And so in order to get to this, I do what I call a ratiolinguistic genealogy. And this is the methodological conceptual framing of the book. And a ratiolinguistic genealogy seeks to denaturalize contemporary co-constructions of language and race by identifying their historical development as part of the European colonial project. And so there are 3 kind of components to a ratiolinguistic genealogy that I'm going to talk about each of these on their own slide. But one is a genealogical stance. The second is a materialist framing of racism. And the third is a ratiolinguistic perspective. And so a genealogical stance rejects essentialist views of race in favor of a discursive view that is reconfigured in response to political and economic changes. And so the primary goal of a genealogical stance towards understanding of race is to identify the traces of these racializing discourses within contemporary debates. And in this way, modern history is seen as a series of discursive reconfigurations of white supremacy. And so that the discourses of race and racial logics kind of shift, but the underlying kind of logic of it is white supremacy. The discourse shifts across time to adapt to changing political and economic contexts, but the underlying foundation is white supremacy. And so a genealogical stance is interested in tracing kind of the legacy of colonial discourses of race and logics of race into the present, and understanding how they impact the ways that people talk about race and racialization in contemporary society. So a materialist framing of racism connects to critical race theory, and sees racism as historically and continuing to be used to justify the material distribution of resources. And so from this perspective of kind of critical race theory, the rise of global capitalism was made possible by the exploitation, I should say, and genocide of racialized communities. And so settler colonialism in the Americas, chattel slavery in the Americas, are part of the production of capitalism, right? So capitalism doesn't pre-exist race. Race and racial logics are part of what produce capitalism as a system of ensuring that certain populations are given access to resources and other populations are denied those resources because they're framed as less human or less deserving of those resources. And so the only way then to address the root cause of contemporary racial inequalities is to focus on the material redistribution of resources. I'm going to get back to that idea in a bit in the presentation, but just the kind of a materialist framing of racism suggests that you can't undo racism just by changing people's ideas, that you actually have to redistribute resources that have been unfairly accumulated across multiple generations because of white supremacy. And then finally, a racial linguistic perspective, which I think is where maybe most people kind of know my work and situate me, it seeks to examine the construction of racial linguistic ideologies that have historically and continue to co-construct language and race in ways that position racialized populations as linguistically deficient. I would argue that the specter of semilingualism is one such racial linguistic ideology. And if we look at kind of the early days of European colonialism, we can see racial linguistic ideologies playing an instrumental role in the dehumanization of indigenous populations, where indigenous languages were depicted as products of, quote, savage minds, that was seen as reflective of being from an earlier stage of human development. So their languages were represented by European colonizers as less evolved, as evidence that these were societies that were less evolved than European societies. In the Jim Crow South, there are many narratives shared by African Americans of family members and friends and other relatives who were murdered and lynched for the sole accusation against them being, quote, speaking like a grown man or woman. And so we can think about kind of the ways that perceptions of language and the kind of perceived boldness of positioning yourself as an equal in a linguistic exchange was enough to threaten the lives of African Americans in the Jim Crow South. And again, seeing another example of race and language being co-constructed with one another. And of course, language was used as the primary justification for the segregation of Mexican Americans in the American Southwest, who officially were considered white, but their segregation was then kind of justified through language, which I would argue was a form of racialization. And so we have many examples in US history of race and language being co-constructed with one another. And that's different than saying that language is a proxy for race or vice versa. That's different than saying that they intersect. What I'm suggesting is that they co-construct with one another, that we really can't understand language without understanding race, and we can't understand race without understanding language, because they both have been used together to sort populations into those who are deemed more fully human and more fully worthy of rights, and those that are deemed less worthy of rights because they're seen as less human or less evolved humans. And so kind of what are racial linguistic ideologies, right? And as I said, the specter of semilingualism is one that I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation, but essentially they co-construct language and race in ways that frame the language practices of racialized communities as deficient and in need of remediation. An important point that Jonathan Rosa and I make in our conceptualization of this concept is that it's not based on actual linguistic performance, but in the ways that the performance is taken up by the listener. And so we're shifting the perspective away from what the speaker is doing or intending to do to what the listener hears or perceives from that speaker and how that connects to the racial status of that speaker and the kind of models of personhood that the perceiver or listener puts onto that speaker based on their social status. And so this kind of comic here is just like a quick illustration of what I mean about this not being based in actual linguistic performance. And so you can see the top 3 panels here. We have a man introduce himself in Spanish, saying, hola, and kind of be really upset about this and say, why don't you want to learn English? And they have a few exchanges in the top 3 panels where the man in Spanish is saying, sí quiero aprender inglés, like he wants to learn English. The other man continues to get really agitated and upset about the person's use of Spanish. And then in the bottom, we have the man ask his son how to say, quiero aprender inglés in English. How do you say that in English, right? And so you have the son who, of course, is serving the role of a linguistic broker here, which is a common practice in many bilingual homes, though it's not oftentimes framed as an asset in the ways that it would be if he were a different racial background. And then the man says, I want to learn English. And then the other man says, no comprendo, right? Now, no comprendo is really more a linguistic token of probably mock Spanish, especially in this context, than what an actual Spanish speaker would use. But what this illustrates to me is that this man's concern isn't with Spanish per se. It's with who he understands this particular Spanish speaker to be. He perceives the Spanish speaker to be an outsider, a threat to the unity of the society, and so responds accordingly to that person's use of Spanish, but of course doesn't have that same reaction to his own attempt at using Spanish, right? And so it's not based in the Spanish itself, right? It's based in who he understands that Spanish speaker to be. And so kind of, this is kind of what I'm trying to get at, where we can't separate linguistic tokens from the social status and the racial status of the speaker. And that oftentimes the same linguistic token or the same kind of linguistic practices can be perceived quite differently based on the social status and racial status of the speaker. And so that this isn't a straightforward linguistic phenomenon. This is a ratio-linguistic phenomenon. And so kind of connecting this to this materialist framing of racism that I kind of introduced, I argue that racial linguistic ideologies were part of the construction of what Cheryl Harris, a critical race theorist, calls whiteness as property. And how she conceptualizes whiteness as property is that essentially how whiteness was defined in kind of the founding of US society was through particular property rights, right? The right to own the land, which meant the displacement of indigenous people who were seen as not people who could own the land in that way, right? But also through actually having the right to own other people as property. That was part of what was bestowed on whiteness, right? And that wealth was accumulated through the displacement of indigenous people, through the exploitation of chattel slavery, right? That was then wealth that was able to be passed down to their children, who were then able to pass that down to their children, and so on and so forth, right? So that the original kind of development of wealth around whiteness was developed through the exploitation and genocide of other populations. And that I'm interested in thinking through kind of the ways that there was a racial linguistic construction of what Noah Webster, who famous for Webster's dictionary, and I've written some on that too. I mean, I'm happy to share the written pieces on that if you wanted to read more about it. Developed this idealized image of what he called the American yeoman, these kind of white male property owners who were seen as speaking pure American language that was free of foreign contamination. And that kind of Webster's image of developing kind of an American language was a racialized project that bestowed certain property rights to people who were deemed as kind of seen as kind of representing this idealized Americanness through not just their race, but also through their linguistic practices. And so I think that I kind of am taking this from a libertarian website, but I'm using it to mean something a little different than probably how they meant it. based on kind of what Cheryl Harris is saying, and based on kind of what I was saying in terms of the ratio-linguistic construction of the American yeoman, I would say that at the founding of US society, property rights were human rights, right? But that certain populations were deemed less than human. And this included people who were enslaved and indigenous people on the land, right? And that ratio-linguistic ideologies were part of the justification for their dehumanization, right? For their genocide, or through converting them into property. And so taking that as my point of entry, this points to the limits of kind of reform and kind of thinking about how we dismantle racial hierarchies, right? So Cheryl Harris, in that piece on whiteness as property, argues that in response to the civil rights demands, whiteness as property shifted to what she called a more modern form through the law's ratification of the settled expectation of relative white privilege as a legitimate and natural baseline. Put differently by another author that I read that I think kind of positions it succinctly, is that in a society that is already racialized, where racial hierarchy defines the socio-political order, the promotion of liberal values such as individual rights becomes a racist endeavor. And it's like, what could that possibly mean? And I think this comic here, again, because I like using comics sometimes to kind of break down really complex idea, I think really gets to what Harris and Bandaru are really trying to challenge us to think through here, right? The first three panels are what Cheryl Harris is defining as whiteness as property, right? That white people, because of the bestowed white rights of property that were bestowed on whiteness, were able to accumulate wealth literally on the back of enslaved Black people, right? And that the first line at the bottom represents kind of the civil rights struggles that Harris is pointing to, right? Saying enough is enough, I'm getting up, I'm not putting up with this anymore. Which leads to a change in the discourse, right? So now this white guy is kind of up on top now and says, I'm really sorry about being racist before. I know better now. So there's been a shift in the discourse, right? But the material benefits of whiteness have not actually been dismantled, right? Have not been called into question. And so the Black man here says, well, give me a hand up. And of course, then the white guy says, of course not. That would be reverse racism. And so that's what Harris means by the settled expectation of relative white privilege, that we're not going to do anything to actually undo those multiple generations of wealth that have been accumulated through the exploitation of Black people. We're just going to instead say, now we're all equal. And I think that's what Boundary also means by that's still racist, right? Because we haven't actually gotten to the root of the issue. And so kind of connected to that, I'm gonna now switch to education and trying to get to bilingual education. I just needed to provide that kind of broader conceptual framing first. Uju Agarwal kind of then talks about and uses this as a lens for analyzing education policy through what she calls the ideological architecture of whiteness as property in education policy. And she traces this ideological architecture to the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And if you look at the actual ruling, segregation was seen as unconstitutional primarily through a focus on the psychological harm that had been done by segregation to the internal psyche of Black children. So there was a very famous doll experiment that many of you may have heard of before, where a social psychologist did experiments with Black children to kind of see their attitudes towards a Black doll versus a white doll, and found that the children preferred the white doll. And so segregation was seen as bad, not because it provided unfair advantages to white people and more resources to white people. It was seen as bad because it provided psychological damage to Black children. And this gets taken up by the Coleman Report, and which was a very influential 1960s education report that essentially argued that the pathologies of racialized communities caused by the legacy of racism lied at the root of racial inequalities. So there's like something really ironic about this discursive turn here, right? So by the 60s, white researchers who for a long time weren't talking about racism at all, right, now acknowledge that racism exists. But they argue that the solution now to racism is to fix the damage that racism had done to racialized communities. And so it's not to undo the material benefits of racism to white people, right? It's to fix the pathologies of racialized people that will allow them then to assimilate into mainstream institutions. And that's what Uju Argawa is calling the ideological architecture of whiteness as property, and thinks about the ways that that gets taken up in education policy, specifically through the Coleman Report and other types of remedial educational kind of initiatives, such as bilingual education, which I'm going to get to. But before I get there, interested in thinking through what I call the racial linguistic foundation of the ideological architecture of whiteness as property. So a kind of precedent for the Brown decision that never got to the Supreme Court, but was still seen as a precedent, was Mendez versus Westminster, which was a case that was brought by Mexican-American plaintiffs in Orange County, California, because of the segregation of Mexican-American children. And they won, right? They won that case. But you can see here, there's very similar discourses around why segregation was bad for these children. Again, it was not because of the unfair advantages it provided to white people. It was because there was a sense that the students weren't going to learn English if they were segregated. And so integration was good because they were going to learn English. And we can see the same rationale used in the Brown decision to say that segregation impeded the educational development of Black children. And so it's focusing on the deficits of the racialized community, right? And suggests that segregation is harming those populations, but is not challenging the fundamental foundations of the materialist kind of foundations of whiteness as property, right? And so now I'm switching to the Bilingual Education Act, because I think all of that historical context is important to understand in order to understand the emergence of the Bilingual Education Act. So the Bilingual Education Act is passed in 1968 within this broader context where people are talking about the Coleman Report. People are talking about kind of another report, the Moynihan Report, that was also built through this ideological architecture of whiteness as property. And those same discourses are used to justify passing bilingual education at the federal level. So the Bilingual Education Act essentially provided limited amounts of federal funding to support innovative bilingual education programs. But you can see Senator Yarborough, who was the chief sponsor of the Bilingual Education Act in the Senate, and was the strongest proponent in the Senate, relies on the ideological architecture of whiteness as property to justify bilingual education. So you can see here, he's arguing that English-only policies cause great psychological harm to these children. And this psychological framing gets taken up by educational psychologists to say this. So Casey Kramer was an educational psychologist who testified in favor of bilingual education as part of the congressional testimonies on the Bilingual Education Act. And he presented his findings on this study here, where compared more advantaged middle-class children to what he characterized as the more restricted language skills of, in this context, we're talking primarily about Mexican-American and Spanish-dominant students. And I want to look closely at some of the discourse that's being used here. So he suggests that the students that he's studying, the Mexican-American children that were part of this study, lack the capacity for abstract language. They lack the capacity for words, for categories, class names, and abstract ideas. So he's suggesting that somehow Mexican Americans are unable to have abstract ideas because of the purported restricted language skills in their community. And this is someone who's arguing in favor of bilingual education, right? And he concludes from this that this to really handicap them in their capacity to use language, right? And suggests that bilingual education can be to help them to develop the ability to think abstractly, that they're not going to be able to have that ability unless they have bilingual education that can teach them in Spanish how to think abstractly. And I think that there's a lot to unpack there, but I would argue that I don't think that the description of students has shifted substantially since then. the terminology may have gotten less stark. But I see these comparisons made all of the time still in terms of comparing white middle class kids to low income Latinx children. And oftentimes it's still these deficit frames that are used. But the suggestion that people can't think abstractly, in my perspective, is dehumanizing, right? It's a dehumanizing discourse that suggests that there's something fundamentally different and other about people who can't think abstractly. There's also, kind of connecting it to the materialist framing of racism that I adopt, an erasure of colonialism in kind of conceptualizations of bilingual education. And it's really that erasure of colonialism that makes possible these ideological architecture of whiteness as property being the primary justification for bilingual education. And so we have prominent sociologists of language, also strong proponent of bilingual education, Joshua Fishman, who in his congressional testimony kind of gently pushes back on the sole focus on Spanish. There was a debate happening whether they should focus just on Spanish or whether they should include all languages. Eventually, they decided to include all languages. But what's interesting here is that what he's doing in this quote is conflating the experiences of Spanish speakers in the US, which at that time were primarily Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, with a general immigrant experience. But Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans have a very specific colonial relationship to the US. That's not the case for other immigrants. And that kind of gets erased by the conflation of Spanish speakers with these other groups. But at the same time, there are also very few mentions of Native American languages. And when they are mentioned, they are often just mentioned in kind of here, like a list of other languages, right? So they have here kind of mention of Indians, along with French speakers, along with Spanish speakers, which also erases the unique settler colonial experience of indigenous people in the US, right? So there's a double erasure of colonialism that happens through the discourses of the Bilingual Education Act. There's the erasure of the specific colonialisms experienced by Spanish speakers in the US. And then there's an erasure of the settler colonialism that impacted the indigenous populations of the US. And erasing those material basis of racism then allows for the emergence of the ideological architecture of whiteness as property to be the primary justification for bilingual education, right? So bilingual education isn't positioned as part of kind of a reparations, right? Part of undoing this material oppression. It's instead seen as fixing the deficiencies of the primarily Latinx community that's being served by the programs. And so this is kind of where we kind of get to semilingualism as a concept that emerges in the outgrowth of the Bilingual Education Act. So in order to receive funding for the Bilingual Education Act, districts or schools had to meet certain accountability metrics, right? And so the Bilingual Education Act mandated an annual report that showed that you were effective in improving the educational opportunities of persons being served in the area. And there were 5 essential elements that were determined for this evaluation here. Now, because the Bilingual Education Act was framed through a remedial lens, the first thing that districts and schools had to do was to prove that students had, quote, limited English proficiency, right? That was the term that was used at the time. Because it was remedial, right? So it couldn't be open to everyone. So you had to prove that someone had sufficient amounts of limited English proficiency to justify their placement in the program. But then you had to prove that they had enough proficiency in Spanish or another language, in this context, mostly it was Spanish, in order to justify placement in the program. And so you tested students in English, and students tested as limited English proficient. And then they tested students in Spanish, and they also tested as limited Spanish proficient. And rather than calling into question the validity of the assessments, doubling down on the ideological architecture of language, of whiteness as property, the term semilingualism was developed to describe these students. And then we get back to our 1976 quote, right? So I'm getting back to that kind of first slide of the Specter of semilingualism, where we have kind of this population of students being described as semilingual as people who know two languages poorly, right? And people who were proposing semilingualism were suggesting that bilingual education could help fix semilingualism, right? You can develop the, quote, strong foundation in the L1 that they would then be able to transfer to the L2. That's still the way that bilingual education is oftentimes justified in contemporary context. I think that we should just reflect on the history that it comes from. It comes from this discourse of semilingualism. And so you then get the rise of standards-based reform after all of that, right? So oftentimes people think about accountability and they trace it to a nation at risk, federal accountability in particular, right? But federal accountability began with the Bilingual Education Act. And what's happened with the Bilingual Education Act was a prelude to what would happen with standards-based reform with the publication of A Nation at Risk in 1983. And so A Nation at Risk was published in 1983 and suggested that low standards in American public schools were a threat to national security, essentially was the argument of that text. And that led to kind of this movement towards standards-based reform and a reliance on standardized assessments that we continue to live with today in the current kind of educational policy regime. Now, EL accountability also continues to develop in this time period in parallel with the general accountability system, with more reliance on standardized assessments and more rigorous identification and reclassification criteria. So in the 80s, we see a much more strong reliance on standardized assessments to determine who is eligible for ESL or bilingual instruction and who will be reclassified out of English learner status. Across the 80s and into the 90s, the threshold becomes much more difficult to be reclassified out of English learner status. And that connects to the rise of academic language, which I'm going to switch to here. And again, I kind of get back to my 2000 quote where Cummings himself connects the legacy of semilingualism to his distinction between social and academic language, or BICS and CALP, right? And is suggesting that there's something about the students that suggests that they're lacking academic language, right? And so the discourse across time becomes much more difficult to test out and be reclassified out of English learner status, because you get more of this kind of idea that students need to master academic language in order to be reclassified, right? And what that ends up being translated to is that they need to be able to engage with grade level content in order to be able to be reclassified. And that's a very high threshold, right? Especially if you're in a school where many of the students are struggling to meet grade level standards for lots of different reasons, right? But what exactly is academic language? This is a question that I oftentimes ask. And oftentimes, like when I ask teachers, I get a very circular argument of like, it's language that's used in academic context. And I say, well, you're using the word in the definition. And then they say, what's language used in school? And I say, well, lots of different types of language are used in school, right? So like, what exactly are we talking about here? And so like one example that I like to kind of give to kind of get people to think through is that I teach a course that's called Intro to Sociolinguistics in Education. And we do a week that looks at language contact, which is where like when people from different language communities come together and their languages tend to influence one another and change one another. Like that's the sociolinguistic phenomenon of language contact. And so one of the texts that I give the students to read is a guidebook to sociolinguistics. And this is how the author of that piece describes language contact. But I also give them a piece on Borderlands La Frontera by Gloria Anzaldúa, and this is how she describes language contact. And so I oftentimes ask teachers when I'm doing like workshops with them, I ask them, is the first one academic language? And usually most of the time teachers say, yeah, for the most part, like there's like complex sentence structure, maybe some content specific vocabulary. And then I ask about the second one and get a range of responses. It depends on the group. Sometimes I get groups that say, absolutely, yes, that is academic language. I get other groups that say, we're not sure because she seems to be using English and Spanish, and that's not usually what happens in academic settings. And then there are others who say, absolutely not, right? And I'm just wondering if that's the best question to ask about either of these texts, right? Or maybe we should be thinking about the choices that each of these authors is making and kind of get out of this dichotomous framing of language as academic or non-academic, which I think oftentimes serves to reinforce racial-linguistic ideologies that always predetermine racialized communities to not have that privileged form, right? And so like an example that I like to give as well is kind of further concretize this, is I say, is yeah academic, right? And I say that and people say, no, you do not use yeah in academic settings. And I see this all the time in classrooms, right? A student might say yeah, a teacher says, what's the word? And the student says yes, right? And there's a long history of policing yeah that actually is very racialized. So that's interesting, right? And so there's a 1918 National Speech League pledge that children were expected to do as part of being part of this National Speech League that said, I will say a good American yes and no in place of an Indian grunt or a foreign yeah, right? And so we don't oftentimes think about yeah as being racialized today. We kind of think about it in terms of formal versus informal. But in 1927, the American Dialect Society suggested that yeah was broken English from the Cherokee Indians. And so now it's talked about in terms of slang or informal, but the roots of that are racial-linguistic, right? It was kind of seen as emblematic of these racialized others, and that's why it's policed. But who is it policed for? Because I wrote an article where I was analyzing this yeah, and I decided to do like a kind of mini social experiment where I began to document how often I heard the term yeah among colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania. And I heard it so much in an hour that I had to stop counting. And if I were to go to my colleague and they said yeah, and I told them, what's the word? That would be hugely inappropriate and offensive. So are we in a society where you need to have a doctorate in order to be able to use the term yeah without being policed? Or is yeah fine, right? And it's only policed because certain populations are using it, and that connects to this longer racial-linguistic policing, right? Is it just kind of a continuation of racial-linguistic policing when actually in many academic contexts, people say yeah all the time and it's completely unmarked, right? And so this ideology that it's not academic is really a racial-linguistic construction. And then a last one, because I kind of like these examples, because I think they help to concretize some of the things I'm talking about, which I know can be very theoretical. Is yo academic? So this is an actual exchange that I heard in a school. Well, one of my research assistants heard this in a school and documented it, where a student said yo, yo, which I mean in Philly people still use yo. I don't know if they use it in other places still. And the teacher says, excuse me, number one, we do not use yo in the classroom. And then there was another conversation later in the year where this teacher was using what I would call an appropriateness-based approach to explain why yo is inappropriate in the classroom. And the teacher is essentially saying that it's fine to say yo and what's up outside of these walls, right? That's fine, you can say yo, but inside this classroom, we do not say yo because it's not formal, right? It's not academic. So where I like this example the best is because at the same school, with the same classroom, with the same teacher, after the teacher said that we don't use yo in this classroom, right? The Walnut Street Theater came to do a show for the students. And the Walnut Street Theater is that they do a lot of like outreach work in Philadelphia to help develop an appreciation for the arts and the kind of public schools and the city. And one of the characters that was part of this play was Rocky Balboa. And of course, when Rocky came into the play, he said, yo, Philly. And the teacher did not correct Rocky and say, we do not say that in this classroom, right? It's because there was a recognizable model of personhood of Rocky. He said, yo, it wasn't policed in the same way, right? And so again, we have to think about how linguistic tokens cannot be understood outside of the model of personhood of the person who's using it, right? And that perceptions of linguistic tokens are shaped by the social status of the speaker, right? So yeah is heard as something that needs to be policed when it's people who have low social status, but it's not heard that way with people with relatively high social status. Yo is heard to be policed when it's done by someone who is a Latinx or Black child in a Philadelphia public school, but not when it's said by like a white ethnic person from Philadelphia. That doesn't need to be policed in the same way. And so all of these kind of racial linguistic ideologies and these kind of different hegemonic modes of perception then create these racial linguistic categories in classrooms that serve to further pathologize the language practices of racialized communities. And one that, well, this is the school that I gave those examples from, and then I'll get into the classification that I'm interested in looking at, which you all probably read about too, is dual language charter school to pseudonym. And you can see it's in Philadelphia, and it's a dual language school, 50-50 model. So official instruction, half the day in Spanish, official instruction, half the day in English, though it's much more complicated than that. Most of the students are economically disadvantaged, and 20% of the students are officially classified as English learners, which is about double the district average of 10%. And many of the students are officially designated by the school to be L1 users of English as well. So they're L1 users of English who are officially classified as English learners. So of course, as someone who's interested in these racial linguistic categories, my research chief and I were interested in further delving into what's going on there. What is that about? And how does that connect to the specter of semilingualism that I've been talking about in this presentation? And so further investigation, what we were able to gather is that what it seems to be happening here is that these are students who are identified as English learners according to state assessment data. We're a WIDA state in Pennsylvania, so it's the access test, who were also, according to the DRA, which is the literacy assessment that they received, reading at a higher literacy level in English, right? And that seems to be what most of the students who were identified as both English learners and L1 English users, that seemed to be the general profile of them. As officially classified as English learners according to the access assessments, which remember are assessing the ability to engage with grade level content in English, not kind of the ability to communicate in English. But according to the DRA and the EDL, were higher in English than in Spanish, according to their literacy levels. And what we found is that teachers often relied on the specter of semilingualism to make sense of the students' bilingualism in ways that impacted their education in ways that actually went counter to what the teachers and the school were hoping. So, and actually in ways that undermined their education. And so, and if you read the article, you kind of saw these case studies. But Amanda, who described herself as made in Puerto Rico but born in Philly, and we don't know if she meant that like literally, like she was conceived in Puerto Rico and then like her mom came to Philadelphia and was born here. I think she meant it more metaphorically. But she was born and raised in Philadelphia, but had a very strong Puerto Rican identity still, right? And her fourth grade teacher suggested that her English learner status meant that she didn't have to meet, oh, wait, let me do this first. So one of her teachers, when we asked her about this, like, why do you think she's officially an English learner and also L1 user of English? She suggested that Amanda was an English learner, almost like a deprivation sense, right? So she begins to look for deficits in Amanda's English to try to understand, like, what about her is making her not be able to be reclassified, even though she was born in the US and probably felt more comfortable communicating in English. And you can see also the way that this negatively impacted her education, where her fourth grade English teacher suggested that because she was officially classified as an English learner, she didn't have to meet grade level reading expectations in English, because English learners oftentimes were expected to meet grade level expectations in Spanish, not in English. And so the teacher wasn't working with her to meet grade level expectations because she didn't think that was her responsibility. But the fourth grade Spanish teacher was actually focusing on lower level basic skills because her Spanish reading skills were actually lower than her English reading skills, according to these official assessments, right? And so she was never being challenged to meet grade level expectations in either English or Spanish, which kind of develops a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So she's never going to meet grade level expectations if she's never provided with scaffolded support to meet those expectations. And then we had Javier, who was described by teachers as a Spanglish kid. And his teachers often described him as kind of having a million wheels in his head, kind of English and Spanish, always going back and forth. But because he had an individualized education plan for speech, oftentimes the teachers attributed this to his speech issue, right? To his kind of official disability, which was interesting because all of the students in the school constantly used English and Spanish together. They constantly engaged in translanguaging. But because he had these different kind of classifications as an English learner, L1 user of English, and as someone with a disability, his translanguaging was seen as somehow uniquely mixed or confused, even though it was seen as relatively unmarked for other students. So again, these categories then shift perceptions of students in ways that further enforce deficit perspectives. And then finally, we have Alejandra, who was a student who actually did very well in her classes, but was still officially classified as an English learner and an L1 user of English. But her teachers often described her as like having a knack for languages, her reading level being where it was supposed to be in English, how she's really amazing in Spanish. And she was a student who I interacted with regularly who was pretty confident in both languages, and was pretty confident at kind of owning a bilingual identity in ways that some of the other students were more reluctant to do. But she was still classified as an English learner. And so when we brought this to the attention of the teachers, they began to look for deficits. And so this is then our own complicity in this, right? Because some of the teachers weren't even aware that she was officially classified as an English learner, which is a whole other issue that we can think through. But when we brought this up to them, it changed their perceptions of her. And they began to look for deficiencies, right? They began to say, what's wrong with her that she's not able to pass this assessment, right? And to be clear, I'm not trying to suggest that these are bad teachers, and I'm not trying to suggest that they don't have the best interests of their students at heart. What I am suggesting is that the categories and the discourses that they have available to them because of these long legacy of racial linguistic ideologies oftentimes push them towards the adoption of deficit perspectives, even if that's not the perspective that they actually want to be subscribing to. And we can think about the contrast between Amanda, Javier, and Alejandra with Princess Charlotte. Princess Charlotte, who was the daughter of Kate Middleton and one of the princes, I always forget which one. And a few years ago, people began to have these like newspaper articles about how she speaks 2 languages at age 2. And this seems to be really amazing and remarkable to people. And headlines like Princess Charlotte can already speak 2 languages at age 2. Princess Charlotte may just start nursery, but can already speak 2 languages. And it's like, people are like amazed by Princess Charlotte's ability to use 2 languages as if she's the first child ever who has existed in this world to speak multiple languages. And to be clear, I think it's great that Princess Charlotte speaks multiple languages. I think it's great for anybody to speak multiple languages. But what I'm concerned with are how the perceptions of her bilingualism are framed in such a way that she gets headlines, right, to celebrate her bilingualism. But the bilingualism of Javier, Alejandra, Amanda are seen with suspicion, right, are seen as not good enough, are seen as deficient in some ways. And we can also think about the double standard that exists in the UK itself, right? People might say, oh, maybe the UK likes languages better than the US does. No, it does not. The same year that everyone was celebrating Princess Charlotte's bilingualism, a woman was attacked in the London subway for using Spanish, right? And what was described as a racially aggravated assault. Now you can imagine if those people who assaulted her for using Spanish heard Princess Charlotte speaking Spanish, they would not attack her, right? The only difference being the social status of the speaker, right? Not the Spanish, right? It's just the social status of the speaker that would change this reaction, where one gets violence and the other one gets celebrated. So what does this mean? Just kind of wrap up the presentation. What this means is that linguistic tokens cannot be separated from the models of personhood associated with the speaker, right? And so we have a long history of the specter of semilingualism that is connected to particular models of personhood, particular racialized models of personhood. And we cannot separate whatever they do with language from that, right? And that the roots of ratiolinguistic policing that we notice, like yeah and yo and kind of these deficit discourses, is not in the attitudes of individual teachers, but the broader histories that have framed certain populations as engaged in inherently deficient language practices, right? And it's those broader ideologies that need to be challenged and dismantled. And that changing institutional listening subject positions require institutional changes, right? Not just changes in the attitudes of the teachers. I mean, these were teachers that really wanted to do well by their students, right? But that the institutional structures made it really difficult for them to do that, and sometimes even impossible. And I think this points to the limits of a language as resource orientation to promoting issues of language diversity. And the language as resource orientation coming out of the work of Richard Ruiz, which is still, I would say, a prominent way of trying to frame issues of language diversity in the US, which is the assumption that language is a resource to be managed, developed, and conserved. And the assumption behind a language as research orientation is that framing language as a resource will have a direct impact on enhancing the language status of subordinate languages and help to ease tensions between majority and minority communities. Well, the language as research orientation, which was proposed and developed in the 1980s, provided an important intervention in combating attacks on bilingual education that had emerged during that time period with the kind of ascendancy of Ronald Reagan's presidential administration. It does little to challenge the ideological architecture of whiteness as property and the specter of semilingualism. So it doesn't get to the root of the issue, right? And so this kind of happens through kind of a move from what I call, with my dissertation advisor and now colleague, Ofelia Garcia, moving bilingual education out of basements into boutiques, right? And that this kind of framing language as a resource, right, I already said that, kind of shifts the conversation away from thinking of bilingual education as supporting minoritized, racialized communities, even in very limited ways, right? Because the Bilingual Education Act was very limited and very remedial, but it was at least focused on racialized students, right? The shift towards kind of boutiques and this language as research orientation shifts away from even kind of making that the priority to shifting to how do we cater to white middle class communities, right? And so dual language programs that have emerged out of this language as research orientation often develop in neighborhoods with large white middle class populations, which is not where many students of color live. White middle class parents often shape the agendas of these programs, and that the bilingualism of Latinx students and other racialized students become the property of white children to continue this legacy of whiteness as property, right? And when I was working on an initiative in Philadelphia on dual language education, there was a reporter who was kind of covering the story, and this is how she framed the story. Philly education program uses the promise of bilingual education to bring parents back to public schools, which is a horrible framing because, of course, there are hundreds of thousands of families already being served by Philadelphia public schools. And so when we say bring parents back to public schools, what parents are we talking about? And what does that do to the parents that have always been there, that have always been being served by these schools? And so who benefits from this framing of language as resource and the kind of move towards dual language and kind of catering to white middle class children? So this is a hypothetical, but this is based on kind of research and my own experience, right? And so a white child enters a dual language program and is positioned as having a, quote, strong foundation in academic language, right? A Latinx child enters the same program and is seen as struggling with academic language in both English and Spanish. And that's how they are received into these programs. And there's tons of research that I can point you to that shows that that is exactly what happens. In particular, one of my students did research on this. And by high school, the white child continues to study Spanish and is praised for their efforts. It's so great that you're learning Spanish. It's so great to put yourself out there, learn another language, learn another culture. The Latinx child is sanctioned in high school for using Spanish by teachers and students who accuse them of talking about them, right? Why are you using Spanish right now? Are you talking about us? Anyone who's a Spanish speaker or a speaker of any other language probably had that accusation study abroad, right? Which research suggests shows that people who study abroad oftentimes are perceived as having higher status Spanish by Spanish instructors. And the Latinx child is not able to afford to go to an elite private institution and attends a local public university and cannot afford to study abroad and doesn't have the opportunity to study Spanish because they adopt kind of a professional career. So when we think about that, then who is actually benefiting from these dual language programs, right? And so, I forgot I was talking about this, but this kind of going to Philadelphia today. So Philadelphia is a very poor city. It's I think the poorest of the 10 biggest cities in the country. 48% of households make less than $35,000 per year, which is considered poverty zone. So almost half the population, and 26% are in poverty, and as officially described, and 12% are in deep poverty. It's the fourth most segregated city in the country. I think New York actually wins on the first. 31% of schools have over 99% students of color. So they're hyper segregated schools. So I began to work on this dual language initiative that I mentioned in the context of the district passing a doomsday budget, where by 2013, 1/3 of Philadelphia students were in charter schools. And a lot of there was a passage of a doomsday budget that led to the closing of 24 traditional public schools and the elimination of basic services in remaining district schools, including the elimination of librarians and counselors in most schools. So dual language programs are starting to be resurrected in this context of like no resources in any of the schools. And so in 2014, I was approached to help the school district kind of develop a new dual language initiative. They wanted to open 6 dual language schools, 5 in North Philadelphia, a low income segregated area of the city, 1 that was in a gentrifying area of the city. And the primary discourse that was being used to justify this was kind of through a discourse of kind of choice, right? Providing choices and competition. And so I'm just going to give you a short case study of one of the schools. They're North Philadelphia. Hamilton Elementary is a pseudonym. And this is in another article that I just kind of published, I think last year. This is a school where 70% of the students are Latinx, 20% African American, 20% the students are classified as English learners, 100% are economically disadvantaged. They began a 50-50 partner teacher model. So one of the teachers was responsible for instructing in English, the other teacher in Spanish. And they had a lot of challenges in changing from a transitional mindset. But the second year that they implemented the program, there was a new teacher who came, a new principal who came in, who was very enthusiastic and supportive. She was a Puerto Rican herself. She had graduated from Philadelphia public schools and had a lot of experience with bilingual education and was really enthusiastic about really kind of raising the status of the program that had really struggled the first year to get teachers to understand that it wasn't a transitional program anymore. But student mobility made that so challenging. So remember, this is a high poverty, low housing stability, low housing security, low food security neighborhood. And so what would happen is that teachers would be getting students throughout the year, right? And one of the second grade teachers in Spanish is kind of talking about kind of like, please don't put children into my class who don't know any Spanish in second grade because they're not going to do well. And the principal was sympathetic to that argument, but was in a very challenging situation because she wanted not to put students into the classes in the upper grades that didn't have Spanish proficiency, but that would have meant making the other classes much bigger. And that was not a decision that she wanted to make. So she says in other schools where there may not be that many kids coming in throughout the year, you can plan it that way, right? You can have it strategically planned so that you have the right mix of students in the class. But here in the 2 years I've been here, we've struggled with that. So what ends up happening in our dual language classrooms are 30 students, and students are coming in throughout the years because she has to put the students somewhere. And if the other classes are already at 35 students, she can't justify not putting the students in that class. And so all of this is kind of just to show that there's a lot of other challenges that have nothing to do with the dual language program that make it really challenging for a program to thrive, right? Which led to a lack of faithful implementation of the program. It became like a hot mess. And then, so a knowledgeable and supportive school leader is not enough for the program to thrive in a context of hyper segregation, in a context of hyper poverty, that we really need broader systemic change to the neighborhood, right? In order for there to be more stability of the student population, which would then allow the program to thrive. So where do we go from here? I would say kind of the specter of semilingualism is not an error in thinking that can simply be corrected, but actually serves to reinforce the racial status quo, right? That we can't just change people's mindsets on that, that there has to be fundamental institutional changes that will completely dismantle the specter of semilingualism. And I think that, but I think we also need to refuse to engage in debates about the legitimacy of the language practices of racialized communities in our research. So I kind of just take that as a truism, right? I take it as a truism that racialized communities engage in legitimate cultural and linguistic practices. And any ideology that suggests otherwise is a racial-linguistic ideology that I can study and try to understand where it comes from, but I'm not going to accept it on its own terms, right? I'm going to point to the ideological position that it's coming from. In particular, in my work now, thinking about kind of the traces of semilingualism and discussions of academic versus social language today. And I think we need to situate our advocacy work within broader projects to dismantle the ideological architecture of whiteness as property and the specter of semilingualism, right? And we have to think through how it is that we actually get to the root of white supremacy and racism in the US by thinking about how we materially redistribute resources, which is really the only way to dismantle the kind of legacy of racial oppression that we've inherited today. So that said, thank you so much for your attention. I think I maybe went a few minutes over, but I welcome any thoughts, questions, comments, and whatnot.
Thank you so much, Nelson. That was really wonderful. And I'm going to moderate the stack. I have things to say, but it seems like a lot of people had comments and questions. So if people want to, let's see, how many people do we have with us? We have more than we can manage. Either use the hand up function, please, or put your in the chat that you'd like to be in the stack, and I'll call on you. We're feeling kind of shy.
Oh, I raised my hand. Can I go?
Yes, please. I was.
I was like the awkward hand raiser. So thank you so much for this your writings and this presentation. So I'm actually a performance studies PhD candidate. So this is very much outside of my wheelhouse. But then when I saw you gesturing towards Foucault and there was some performative language in your articles, I was very much like, okay, I can respond and I have something to say. So first, on the most sort of basic of levels, I'm interested in how, if at all, this is different from these common notions of code switching. And so that's just like my first kind of like more basic question. And then from there, as I'm reading your piece, I actually have like a favorite quote that I texted out to all of my friends where you were talking. It was amazing. I have it like in my phone highlighted. It was fantastic. But it was the section here where you're really talking about this meta discursive regime and how, and this is in your, I'm sorry, this is in the technically in EL, so the production of a ratio-linguistic, right? So I was drawn to this idea, and I went back and read your 2013 piece where you're talking through governmentality, and then you develop it more in this article. So I'm kind of gonna talk through one thing just because we have to do reflections as well. And I want to reflect on this. So in a lot of your pieces, I like this idea of having bilingualism versus doing bilingualism. And that's my performance studies kind of, right? Like, so how are these students embodying and then therefore performing their bilingualism in these different ways? And then throughout your piece, I was thinking a lot about Austin's how to do things with words, right? And how like, and you even slipped on I wrote it down on your utterance slide. On your yo slide, you said utterance. And I was like, that's exactly what I was getting at, right? Like these different utterances and how based on kind of the, like which language they're in and how these students are saying them, like how that might be a performative enactment of where they're situated linguistically. And then finally, I wondered, I haven't had time to develop it, but I was thinking about how these students who are in EL are kind of policed in such a way or tracked in such a way that they're aware that they're lacking a certain kind of skill. And I say lack because I was thinking of Lacan, and in that article, you gestured towards desire, right? And so for Lacan, lack is tethered to this desire. And I was wondering if it might be interesting to think about these interviews with, because these children are made aware that they're lacking some certain sort of skill, and they have this then desire to, and I'm thinking here as a Black Studies scholar as well, right? Like when I oscillate even when I teach between like this very colloquial, I use yo, right? Like I sometimes will slip and use like double negatives, and I do that as a learning device and just also intentionally, like I'm here, but like, yo, where's your homework, right? Like those sorts of things. So I was just wondering if you'd considered that, or maybe if it would just be an interesting turn, right, to think about how this, like how lack fits into this framework for these children and their desire to have access to these higher level language skills. But thank you. So I've really appreciated this. This was great. So thank you.
Well, no, thank you for that comment. I mean, I would love to talk to you more about all of that, just because I'm not in performance studies, but I certainly think that we have a lot that we could talk about there. In regards to the question about code switching, I mean, I think code switching has multiple genealogies, right? And has multiple meanings across different communities. In linguistics proper, kind of where I would situate kind of myself, I think that code switching comes from kind of normative perspective that presupposes homogeneous codes as the norm, right? And that anything that deviates from that is switching. But from my perspective, language is inherently fluid. And the ideological production of homogeneity is part of the production of whiteness, right? And part of the production of Westernness as kind of this kind of pure in opposition to all of the other. And so if you start from that perspective, then you're switching, right? If you're not, then what is it that you're doing, right? And then it's only certain populations that are marked as hybrid or heterogeneous, right? There are certain populations that are perceived as mixing or switching, and others that are marked as not doing that, right? Even though, from my perspective, language is inherently fluid, right? There's not a homogeneous code that we're beginning from. And at the same time, but I think there's another genealogy of code switching that's more about kind of political struggle, which I think is quite different, right? And I think that's almost a completely separate conversation that's coming more out of kind of a Black genealogy, right? And that's always been in tension with the more formal linguistic code switching. But I think that the most productive point of entry into thinking through that is rejecting the idea that homogeneous codes are anything other than ideological constructs, and then thinking about which populations are then perceived to be homogeneous and perceived to be engaged in homogeneous utterances, and how that's part of the production of kind of hegemonic whiteness and kind of Western conceptions of language.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for all of that stuff. And I appreciate the Foucault connection, because my students get tired of Foucault, but I say Foucault helps me to talk to people across disciplines. So it's helpful.
It worked. I'm telling you, I said to my friend, I was like, never, because my friend's a PhD in ed. And I was like, never mind, I'm interested now.
Very nice. Who else has some thoughts or questions? Nico, seems like you're about to hit the mute button. Why don't you go ahead? And then Michael.
Sure. So, you know, one thing that came up for me is the idea that when we are assessing students based off of academic language, we're actually assessing them based off of like how well they conform to the structure of school. And so something that you talked about today that brought it up for me was that, like, you know, when you look at Gloria Anzaldua's work, she's sort of doing some intentional transgression, and it's purely out of like her choices of how she wants to use language to express herself. But I think in schools, teachers are constantly struggling with like, what is the line between like expression and transgression? And, you know, for me, it brings back like, for me, like when I hear the N-word in my classroom, like, I don't know, like, you know, like how to go about it in a consistent way. And so I was hoping that you would speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, so the framework that I have developed to think through language in a non-dichotomous way, which I think is the best point of entry into any conversation about the politics of language use, is the metaphor of language architecture. And I kind of think about it in the ways that we think about kind of like architecture. I'm not a design person. So if there's anyone who's a design person, help me think through this more. But my understanding of kind of like architecture is that like there are certain parameters that one must adhere to in order for a building to be safe, right? But that within that, there's a lot of design work that happens. And that's kind of a metaphor that I use for thinking about kind of language. There are shared conventions of language that people learn as part of members of communities. And then there are the design work that each individual does in order to kind of show their own unique style and expressive kind of voice. So when we begin from that perspective, then students are already coming into classrooms with knowledge of how language works. And we can use that knowledge in our classrooms to help them to kind of engage with any tasks and new language practices that we maybe want them to become socialized into. And so I think that then kind of shifts away from a language policing model of teaching, which I think is oftentimes the inadvertent position that many teachers feel like they're in, towards a language exploration model where we can kind of sit with students and have them explore the politics of language choices and use, right? And kind of have that as part of the conversation. And something that I like to tell teachers that I work with is that language is actually like really creative, right? And can be really interesting. That's why I study it, right? But classrooms oftentimes frame language as if it's dead and boring and just like a list of rules that you have to learn. And that's sad because like that's not how anyone experiences language out in the real world. And I don't know if I'm directly answering your question. I think I'm more kind of like offering like a different framing of how to think about language in the classroom. I think that the question about the use of the N-word is really tricky and fraught. And I'm sure everyone here would have slightly different opinions on its use in any context versus some context versus some people. But I think a language exploration model would at least provide the space to begin to think through questions like that.
Thank you so much for that. It makes me think about like this is a dialogue rather than, you know, a set of rules that we're trying to force students into.
Right, and I think in the end, I always tell students it's up to them to decide what they want to do with it, right? Like if a student wants to adopt what are perceived to be standard forms and everything that they write, because that's how they want to position themselves, that's their prerogative, right? They're the ones that are constructing that text. Now, if someone wants to deviate from those conventions in certain ways because that reflects who they are or their style, that's also their choice, right? Like in the end, it's about the author's choice. And in K-12 education, they're always talking about author's craft, right? Like how authors make decisions about constructing text. To me, that's how we should be thinking about it. Like you are going to position yourself in the way that makes sense to you. I'm just here to provide you with options, right? For you to think through together.
Thanks for that fascinating and really important talk. I really appreciated it. I was wondering in your genealogy, I was sort of wondering whether you were going to talk about Lau versus Nichols and the sort of civil rights impact it's had, and thinking about the idea of the, sort of this discourse of equal opportunity and equal access, and this notion that equal treatment doesn't equal, you know, participation, equal access. I don't know how much the discourses there are similar to the ones you were talking about, or whether it feels like there's something a little bit different going on. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I mean, in the chapter that I'm working on, I am looking at the Lau remedies. as part of the construction of kind of this kind of EL accountability policies. And there's kind of contradictory discourses in the Lao remedies. Like there is this kind of sense that there are students who are like really bilingual, and then there are some that are like maybe bilingual. It's like, I mean, I would have to like show you some of the wording of it is kind of interesting and strange. What I will say about kind of Lao and the civil rights kind of framing in general is that what I have found in kind of the historical work is that because of the remedial framing of the BEA, activists and lawyers had an incentive to develop a threshold for English learner to be as high as possible, right? So you wanted as many students as possible to be able to count under this remedial category. And that's where then we get semilingualism. That's where we get kind of Bix and Cal. But it's kind of activists and lawyers are kind of being mobilized to double down on deficit perspectives as a way of trying to provide services to students that they think that they actually need and are entitled to. Now we could imagine if the policy had been framed differently, if it hadn't been framed through a remedial lens, we wouldn't have to have a dichotomy at all, right? We wouldn't have to have someone who is limited English proficient versus someone who's not. We could just have bilingual kids, right? And they could be in bilingual classes together doing bilingual things. But because the policy had been framed through a remedial lens, it then kind of has this ripple effect on then kind of activists themselves are then saying, well, I know that they can communicate in English, but actually they can't really communicate in English in the normative ways that you expect them to be able to. So actually we need to give them this kind of limited label. And so it's kind of like an irony of kind of history that it's this institutionalization then kind of recruits activists to double down on these same deficit discourses. And that's not meant to criticize the lawyers and activists at all. That's meant to kind of see how deeply embedded these logics are.
Thanks, that was great.
Yeah.
Ankit, do you want to go next, or Yasmin? Yasmin, was your next point on this? Sorry. Okay, Ankit, you go ahead.
Great. Yeah, I had a couple of questions. This is really fascinating. Thank you so much. The first was if we wanted to take this framework to different transnational settings and how, you know, variation in racial linguistic practices will change, let's say in Europe or in Asia. And I'm thinking in particular about settings where nationalism will be more a force that generates standard language rather than something like colonialism. I'm thinking about Hindi supremacy in India, which is used to police other languages in a very diverse linguistic space. So that kind of brings me to my second question is, you know, what happens when there's linguistic policing within ethnic or racial groups, right? Even let's, you know, this came up in the chat conversations about class boundaries of language and how class dignifies certain types of languages. And I'm thinking about, you know, Cockney English versus BBC English in England or in India, different kinds of practices. So I guess the point is this a set of practices limited to race? And if not, how does it change when it shifts to a different category?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that I would answer that by saying, I think it depends on what we mean by race, right? And so there's an article by an author whose last name is Nishiyama. Nishiyama is the last name, where he uses Foucault's kind of framing of biopolitical racism to look at kind of Japanese discourses of race that were produced as part of Japanese settler colonialism of Korea, right? Where from the US perspective, that would be, oh, well, these are the same race of people, right? He's suggesting that no, if we think of biopolitics seriously, and if we take it outside of kind of the Eurocentric framing of Foucault, we can take that as a kind of foundation for modernity in general, right? Which is kind of the construction of certain populations that society must protect and certain populations that society must be defended against, right? And so if we adopt a stronger, kind of like a more broad view of race, I think Nishiyama calls it racism without race. I think it allows us to provide a cohesive framework for kind of connecting these different these different phenomena, while also then being able to account for the specific instantiations of them in specific contexts, right? Because I think we want to be careful not to kind of impose a racial logic from one context to another context, but I think that the biopolitical framing is broad enough that it can help us to understand kind of the foundations of modernity as producing certain populations as more human than others, and then thinking about kind of how that works through anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, Orientalism, but also all of these other distinctions that are also being kind of produced in different kind of local communities.
Great. Yasmin, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so I actually really appreciate you going first because it ties into the question that I was going to ask, was just thinking about how like different social, political, and geopolitical kind of how that can shape this racial linguistic kind of framework, right? So specifically, I was thinking about, since your case study was in Philly, and we see this as like a major northeastern city, and you gave a breakdown where almost half of the city is classed in a similar way. I was thinking about how this framework might work, right? I'm from North Carolina. I went to predominantly white private schools, right? So that's why now I kind of wear my oscillation between language as like this badge of like, I can finally do that. But thinking about how for children who aren't in these settings where it's as racially diverse or as class, right? Like the more punitive treatment they may receive because their inability to kind of adapt these normative language structures might be seen as insubordinate, or them not doing their homework or kind of otherwise adhering to that. And so then I was thinking about further with these regimes and like through this framework, if we want to continue with this genealogy of Foucault, like this discipline and punishment, right? And like even the way then how we begin to police ourselves, right? So this panopticon, like, so that's where like this internalized racism comes, where some people, if they're Spanish speakers, like they don't want to speak Spanish in that way because it marks them as in a certain kind of way. So I was thinking about that. And then, and then to your point about Foucault and biopolitics, I think, so Alex Wahalia in his book, Habeas Viscus, takes up a kind of biopolitical reading that accounts for race in another sort of interesting way that I think might tie in. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that was, I don't know if I heard a question, but more insights, and I think those were all good insights.
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
I'm also like the performance study, like we're just weird. You got to like work with us. We're just a weird group. But
I think there was something about the thinking about different contexts.
Yeah, so how this framework might work, right? Even if, right, instead of this, a child who is in a Philly private school, right? Who like, I was a scholarship kid, right? How then they still have to navigate at home. Their parents aren't able to sign these documents because they don't, you know, the ink, right? Like, so how then might this work if we're thinking about it in the way that you do, as language is this fluid, or as I would say, like this porous kind of space, how that might work?
Yeah, I think that, I guess that kind of interesting empirical question, and a lot of my work isn't classroom based, right? Most of my work is more discursive, historical, and I do work in classrooms mostly as kind of case studies, like in the article that you read, where I'm kind of using portraits of classrooms to connect them to these broader discursive historical kind of phenomenon. But I think once we start thinking about things kind of at the level of like individual experiences, that things become quickly much more complicated, right? And I think that the trick or the challenge, and this is something that we've been grappling with in the course that I'm teaching this semester on genealogies of race and language in education, is how do we kind of talk about individual experiences without then doubling down on biological views of race. And that sounds easy to do, but sometimes it quickly becomes like we begin to subscribe to the same racial logics and trying to kind of represent kind of racialization, right? And so, I mean, so I think that's not really answering your question, but I think that for me, it's kind of individual experiences is a very important empirical question that I think there needs to be more work on. And I think there is some work that's starting to emerge, kind of more ethnographic work using this racial-linguistic perspective, which isn't necessarily like my immediate point of entry into it. But I think the challenge is how do we do that without reifying the same race and language categories that are part of the issue to begin with, right? And so something that like I point to is like a lot of qualitative researchers will then make these like tables that sort students into these demographic categories, which makes it seem like very objective. And I was like, but you realize that all of these categories like are all like historically produced as part of governmentality, right? Like these are not objective descriptions of anything. And so it's like, and then sometimes like reviewers want me to put tables of like, what's the L1 of the students? And I'm like, no, I'm not gonna do that because that's actually part of the issue, right? So how do we represent individual experiences without kind of reifying these categories, I think is a challenge. But yeah.
And I also just realized that this was recorded and I said I was a weird performance studies student. So hi, department.
I mean, I like weird. I think weird is great.
No, but I was like, oh no, this is recorded. So they're going to see this. I love it here.
Yeah, I mean, I think weird is great. We should all be weird. Being a little weird is great.